Long before Charles wore the crown, one relationship had already changed how millions viewed him. What began behind closed doors became a public humiliation, a family fracture, and a permanent stain on the monarchy, one that palace officials feared could reopen at the worst possible moment. Charles and Camilla's connection had once existed in a private world, protected by silence, distance, and the belief that personal feelings could remain separate from royal duty. But Charles was not free to build an ordinary life. He was the future king, and every choice around him carried the weight of succession. Affection was never simply affection. Marriage was never only marriage. The woman beside him would one day stand beside the crown. His marriage to Princess Diana was expected to secure that future. She was young, admired, and quickly embraced by the public. Yet beneath the ceremony were expectations neither of them could easily survive. Diana was expected to adapt to a rigid institution. Charles was expected to bury the emotional life he had known before her. Both were placed inside roles larger than themselves, and as the distance between them grew, the palace continued presenting unity. For a time, the silence held. Then, private dissatisfaction began escaping into public view. Conversations were leaked. Interviews became weapons. Friends chose sides. Accusations moved through newspapers and television screens until the marriage was no longer a private tragedy. It became a national argument about loyalty, honesty, and the moral authority of the monarchy itself. Diana's popularity made the damage even more severe. The public did not see only a failing marriage. They saw a deeply admired woman describing loneliness, while the future king appeared cold, protected, and emotionally distant. Every expression was examined. Every absence became suspicious. Charles was no longer judged only as a husband. He was being judged as the man who might one day become sovereign. Inside the palace, the fear was immediate. The monarchy depended on the belief that duty came before desire, yet the intimate details now reaching the public suggested the opposite. Advisors allegedly warned that if Charles became permanently associated with betrayal, his accession might never feel legitimate, no matter how lawful it remained. That warning placed him inside an impossible choice. To surrender Camilla meant abandoning the relationship he believed had survived years of pressure. To keep her meant risking the inheritance that had defined his entire life. Love and duty were no longer separate paths. They had become opposing forces, each demanding a sacrifice. Diana's death made the conflict even harder to reshape. Public memory froze around her pain, leaving Charles unable to defend himself without seeming to challenge the memory of a woman the world continued to mourn. Behind closed doors, private polling and confidential briefings allegedly asked the question no royal wanted spoken aloud: would the public ever accept Charles as king with Camilla beside him? The answer remained uncertain, but the palace understood that the affair was only the wound everyone could see. Beneath it were darker questions about influence, access, reputation, and the hidden power used to rebuild a future king. Because once Camilla's place beside Charles became permanent, the question inside the palace was no longer whom the future king loved, it was how far the institution had gone to protect that love. Charles's reputation did not recover by accident. Behind the warmer photographs and carefully controlled appearances, an alleged palace campaign worked for years to make the unacceptable appear inevitable. But every image repaired came at a cost, and someone else was often made to pay it. The effort was patient, because the damage was deep. Charles could not simply ask the public to forget the past. The palace had to replace one image with another. The distant husband would become the devoted public servant. The controversial heir would become the thoughtful prince. The man once defined by scandal would be presented as someone preparing responsibly for the crown. Royal communications teams allegedly began shifting attention toward his charities, environmental work, and years of public duty. These causes were real parts of his life, but they also served a larger purpose. Each speech, visit, and carefully chosen interview helped build a new story around him. The old questions did not disappear. They were slowly pushed aside. Camilla's introduction was handled with even greater care. There was no sudden demand that the public accept her. Instead, she appeared gradually, first at controlled engagements, then beside Charles at more important events, and eventually in positions that would once have caused outrage. Familiarity became the strategy. What had been shocking was made ordinary, and what had once seemed impossible began to look permanent. But the operation allegedly carried a darker side. Whenever pressure returned to Charles, unfavorable stories about other members of the royal family sometimes seemed to rise at exactly the right moment. A younger royal's mistake could dominate the headlines. A family disagreement could suddenly become public. The attention moved, and Charles was given space to recover. Inside the monarchy, that pattern created suspicion. William and Harry allegedly began to understand that royal households were not simply working together, they were competing. Each office wanted better coverage, stronger public approval, and greater influence. The younger royals feared they were being used as shields in a campaign designed to secure Charles and Camilla's future. Behind closed doors, courtiers reportedly debated every detail. Which title should Camilla use? Where should she stand? How should the past be described? Which questions would be answered, and which would be ignored? Even ceremonial language became part of the plan, because one careless phrase could reopen years of anger. The true goal was never popularity alone. It was survival. Senior advisors allegedly feared that Charles could reach the throne legally, but without enough public trust to hold the monarchy together. Sensitive correspondence was said to exist between his office, media figures, advisors, and powerful supporters, revealing how carefully the campaign had been managed. Charles reportedly convinced himself that every compromise protected the crown. Yet each bargain weakened trust inside his own family. The more successful the operation became, the more dangerous its hidden methods appeared. The strategy might have remained hidden behind polished ceremonies if Prince Harry had stayed silent, but when he turned against the institution, he carried knowledge capable of destroying the story Charles had spent decades rebuilding. When Prince Harry left royal life, he did not leave empty-handed. He carried memories of private meetings, media bargains, family confrontations, and promises he believed had been broken. For Charles, the danger was not simply losing a son. It was losing control of a witness. Harry's departure was more than a family argument. Inside the palace, it allegedly became a crisis involving reputation, security, money, and control. A prince raised within the institution was walking away from it, and he understood how its most sensitive systems worked. He knew which conversations happened in private, which stories were challenged, and which were quietly allowed to spread. At the center of Harry's anger was his belief that history was repeating itself. He had watched his mother struggle against a palace system she believed had isolated and misunderstood her. Years later, he became convinced that similar forces were being used against Meghan. To Harry, hostile headlines were not random. They were part of a wider pattern involving leaks, briefings, and royal offices protecting themselves at someone else's expense. Charles was caught in a painful position. He was a father watching his son pull away, but he was also the future head of an institution Harry appeared ready to expose. Every private call carried risk. Every emotional conversation could later become evidence. Compassion and caution began to collide. Emergency discussions allegedly followed. Titles, public funding, security protection, invitations, royal duties, and the couple's connection to the crown were all debated. Each decision carried consequences. If Charles gave Harry too much, critics might accuse him of weakness. If he withdrew too much, Harry could present it as punishment. Then came the interviews, the accusations, the memoir. Each disclosure struck harder than the last, because together they formed a pattern. The palace faced an impossible choice: respond and give the allegations more attention, or remain silent and allow suspicion to grow. William was reportedly furious. For him, private family pain had become public material, and he allegedly believed Charles had failed to stop the rupture before it became uncontrollable. The conflict between the brothers deepened, but beneath that anger was a more serious fear. Harry may have known far more than he had revealed. His knowledge allegedly extended beyond personal disputes. It touched relationships between royal offices, senior advisors, newspapers, and powerful figures who benefited from access. Charles was reportedly warned that further revelations could damage confidence in his judgment, especially once he became king. The emotional cost was brutal. Charles had to see Harry as both a wounded son and a threat to the crown. Every attempt at reconciliation risked another betrayal. Every act of distance pushed Harry further away. And while the family focused on what Harry might reveal about palace briefings, another danger was already emerging, one involving donors, influence, and the hidden price of royal access. Yet even Harry's accusations could be dismissed as the anger of an estranged son, until a trail of money raised a far more dangerous question about who had been allowed close to the future king. Royal scandals become truly dangerous when they stop being personal and begin following the money. Behind charitable dinners, private introductions, and generous donations stood an explosive suspicion. Had powerful individuals discovered that proximity to Charles could purchase something far more valuable than gratitude? For years, Charles's charitable network had been central to his public identity. It allowed him to speak about causes larger than himself and gave purpose to a life spent waiting for the throne. His foundations supported communities, conservation, education, and young people. They also placed him at the center of a powerful circle filled with wealthy donors, business leaders, political figures, and international connections. That influence created opportunity, but it also created danger. The palace allegedly became concerned that some donors were not giving only because they believed in Charles's causes. They wanted access. They wanted invitations, private meetings, introductions, honors, or the prestige of being seen close to the future king. Nothing had to be promised openly. The relationship itself could carry value. Intermediaries reportedly became the link between those seeking influence and Charles's inner circle. They arranged meetings, managed introductions, and carried messages. This distance protected the prince from direct involvement, but it also made the system more difficult to understand. The more people stood between Charles and the donor, the easier it became for responsibility to disappear. Palace officials were left with a dangerous question. Where did determined fundraising end, and where did private influence begin? Charles allegedly saw the issue differently. He believed the causes mattered. If wealthy people could be persuaded to support meaningful work, then aggressive fundraising seemed justified. But he may have underestimated how those methods looked from outside. What appeared to him as commitment could appear to the public as access being exchanged for generosity. Then came claims of confidential correspondence discussing donations, meetings, honors, and introductions to senior figures. Even without proof of a direct bargain, the appearance of favor was damaging. The monarchy depended on neutrality. It had to stand above private deals, political pressure, and personal reward. Once that trust weakened, every royal relationship could be questioned. Courtiers reportedly feared political leaders would begin distancing themselves if more details emerged. Some insiders believed Charles had to be protected at any cost. Others argued that advisors and intermediaries should be sacrificed before the scandal reached the future king directly. Loyalty became selective. Everyone wanted to save the crown, but not everyone agreed on who should pay the price. The financial questions soon widened beyond donations. They revived old arguments about royal wealth, the duchy, inherited estates, tax arrangements, and how much the public truly knew about private royal property. And hidden inside those disputes was an inheritance far more personal than money. A collection whose ownership could reopen wounds the palace had spent years trying to seal. But the most emotionally charged inheritance was not land, money, or privilege. It was a collection of jewels carrying the memories of dead queens, broken marriages, and promises that could no longer be verified. Some royal jewels are valuable because of their diamonds. Others are dangerous because of the women who wore them. After Queen Elizabeth II's death, one secret list allegedly divided the palace, placing Charles between his mother's final wishes, Camilla's expectations, and a history that refused to stay buried. The dispute began with a question few outside the monarchy fully understood. Not every royal jewel belonged to the same collection. Some were tied permanently to the crown. Others formed part of the royal collection, protected for future generations. But certain pieces were private property, allowing the monarch to decide who would receive them and under what conditions. That difference turned inheritance into a quiet battlefield. According to palace whispers, Queen Elizabeth had left behind a private inventory containing personal instructions for several important pieces. The list allegedly went beyond names and ownership. It included warnings, limitations, and wishes shaped by decades of family tension. Some jewels could be worn freely. Others carried emotional histories so powerful that placing them on the wrong person could create an immediate scandal. The most sensitive pieces were those connected to Diana. It was allegedly understood that certain jewels associated with the late princess should never appear on Camilla. To advisors, the restriction was practical. One necklace or tiara could revive the pain of the broken marriage and reopen the public argument over who had suffered, who had survived, and who had eventually been rewarded. But Camilla reportedly saw the matter differently. She had become queen, yet the past still seemed able to control what she wore, where she stood, and how fully she could inhabit her position. Every restriction appeared to suggest that Diana's memory remained stronger than her title. Charles was trapped between two loyalties. Defending Camilla meant proving that her place beside him was complete. Respecting his mother's alleged instructions meant accepting limits that could humiliate his wife. Either choice carried emotional and political consequences. William was said to have taken a harder position. He allegedly believed certain pieces should eventually pass to Catherine or remain connected to Diana's sons. To him, those jewels were not decoration. They were part of his mother's unfinished legacy. Princess Anne reportedly made the conflict even more dangerous. She was believed to know more about Queen Elizabeth's private intentions than Charles expected, and she allegedly refused to support any attempt to reinterpret them. The tension reached its breaking point when a historic necklace or tiara was removed from an important ceremonial plan at the last moment. The change was described publicly as routine, but behind palace doors it allegedly triggered a bitter confrontation. This was no longer about ownership. It was about which woman would define the new reign. The late queen who had guarded the institution, Diana, whose pain still shaped public memory, or Camilla, who now stood beside the king. Advisors warned that if the inventory leaked, every unresolved controversy surrounding marriage, inheritance, privilege, and royal power would return at once. Then, the document that could settle the dispute disappeared. When that document could no longer be found, suspicion moved through the palace, and for the first time, members of Charles's own family began questioning not only his decisions, but his right to make them. The monarchy presented unity to the world, but behind guarded doors, Charles faced resistance from the very people expected to defend him. Old loyalties hardened, private alliances formed, and one terrifying possibility emerged. The king's greatest threat might come from inside his own family. William had become increasingly protective of the monarchy he would one day inherit. He no longer viewed every disagreement as a private family matter. To him, each decision made by Charles could strengthen or weaken the future of the crown. The old scandals had already damaged public trust, and William allegedly believed the new reign required a clear break from the compromises that had shaped his father's rise. Charles saw that position as a challenge to his authority. He had waited decades to become king. Now, just as he was attempting to establish control, his eldest son appeared unwilling to follow without question. William wanted caution, distance, and reform. Charles wanted loyalty and recognition. Their conflict was not simply between father and son. It was between the reigning monarch and the man the public already imagined replacing him. Princess Anne reportedly became another quiet source of resistance. She saw herself as a guardian of Queen Elizabeth's standards and traditions. Changes involving titles, jewelry, residences, or ceremonial roles were not small matters to her. If she believed they were driven by personal preference rather than duty, she allegedly refused to support them. Edward and other family members attempted to remain cautious. They understood the danger of choosing sides, but silence became harder as the divisions widened. Every palace discussion seemed to carry hidden meaning. A seating decision could signal loyalty. A staff appointment could shift influence. Access to the king could determine which version of events he heard first. Camilla's circle reportedly viewed the resistance as something darker. After years of public service and slow acceptance, they believed certain relatives still wanted to limit her authority and deny her full legitimacy as queen. What William or Anne considered protection of tradition, Camilla's supporters interpreted as a campaign to keep her permanently beneath Diana's memory. Confrontations allegedly spread across ceremonial precedents, patronages, royal homes, jewelry, advisors, and private audiences. Charles began to fear that his reign was being treated as temporary, an uncomfortable bridge between Elizabeth and William. Then came the rumors of regency. Advisors were said to have discussed what might happen if illness, scandal, or falling support made it impossible for Charles to continue fully. The idea struck at his deepest insecurity. His own son would not need to overthrow him. He would only need to appear ready when Charles failed. The missing document made the crisis more dangerous. Someone allegedly possessed it and was using its existence as leverage to force changes in palace policy. Charles did not know whom to trust, but he knew the pressure was moving closer to public view. A major ceremony was approaching. Every senior royal would be present. The monarchy intended to display unity, but the smallest refusal, absence, or change in position could expose everything. The final confrontation would not occur in a secret meeting or behind a locked door. It would unfold during a ceremony designed to prove that Charles's monarchy remained strong, united, and untouchable. The palace had survived affairs, betrayals, financial questions, and family rebellion, but all of them now converged around one public moment. As Charles prepared to demonstrate control, a private warning reached him. Unless he changed course immediately, the monarchy could face its gravest crisis in generations. The occasion was meant to end the rumors. Senior royals would gather beside Charles at a major state ceremony, presenting the monarchy as stable after months of tension. Every detail carried meaning. Palace planners debated the procession order, seating arrangements, formal greetings, jewelry, and which family members would stand closest to the king. Nothing could appear uncertain. Nothing could suggest division. But beneath the careful planning, the family was moving toward confrontation. William allegedly warned that he would withdraw from part of the ceremony unless Charles reversed a disputed decision involving Camilla, the royal inheritance, and the way damaging stories had been handled by palace officials. To William, this was not rebellion. It was protection. He believed the future of the monarchy could not be secured by repeating the secrecy that had weakened it. Charles saw an ultimatum. He was furious that his son would challenge him at such a critical moment, yet behind that anger was fear. If William failed to appear beside him, the absence would become the story. Every photograph, headline, and public comment would raise the same question: had the heir lost confidence in the king? Then the missing document returned. It was allegedly delivered with supporting materials suggesting that Queen Elizabeth's final instructions had been selectively interpreted, and perhaps altered in the way they had been presented to the family. The document touched the jewelry dispute, but its consequences reached much further. If published, it could connect the private inheritance conflict to questions about Camilla's influence, palace briefings, financial access, and Charles's judgment. Suddenly, every scandal threatened to become one story. Charles faced a brutal choice. He could defend Camilla's position and risk William's withdrawal. He could protect his authority and allow the document to surface, or he could surrender part of his control to preserve the institution he had spent his life waiting to lead. At the final moment, he compromised. A disputed jewel was removed. The procession was adjusted. Certain ceremonial positions were quietly changed, while officials described every alteration as routine protocol. William remained. Camilla accepted the revised arrangement. The family appeared united, but the agreement behind that unity was fragile, forced, and deeply personal. The ceremony passed without public collapse. Charles remained king. Yet the victory felt hollow. The evidence had not been destroyed. It remained with someone beyond his control, ready to return if another promise was broken. The institution had saved Charles, but not entirely out of loyalty. Removing him then could have exposed the machinery protecting them all. Charles survived the scandals that nearly cost him the crown. But survival came with a private price. From that night forward, he would reign knowing that the monarchy had protected him once and might not choose to protect him again.